I grew up in a small, quiet town where the church wasn't just a place you visited on Sundays. It was the center of everything. My family was devout, and from the time I could walk, I was at Mass, listening to the hymns, feeling the reverence in the air. My mother would kneel beside me, her hands clasped tightly in prayer, and I'd watch her face, so peaceful, so certain. I wanted to feel that certainty too. Even as a child, I knew I wanted to give my life to God. It was the only thing that made sense to me. By the time I was a teenager, my decision was clear. I was going to join the convent. While my classmates were dreaming about careers or traveling the world, I spent my evenings reading scripture, volunteering at the church, and praying for guidance. I wasn't interested in dating or parties. I wanted something more, something eternal. I wanted to serve God with every part of me. When I told my parents about my decision, my mother cried. She was proud, of course, but she also worried about what I was giving up. "Are you sure this is what you want?" she asked me one evening, her voice trembling. "This isn't an easy path." I nodded, full of conviction. "This is what I'm meant to do," I told her. And I believed it with all my heart. The day I entered the convent was one of the most profound moments of my life. I remember standing at the gate, suitcase in hand, looking up at the stone walls and the towering cross that seemed to touch the sky. I felt a mix of awe and nervousness, but more than anything, I felt peace. This was where I belonged. The sisters welcomed me warmly, their faces kind and their voices soft. The first few weeks were everything I had hoped for. Our days were structured and purposeful. Prayers at dawn, chores throughout the morning, scripture study in the afternoon, and reflection in the evening. I loved the rhythm of it, the sense of being part of something sacred. When we gathered in the chapel, our voices rising together in song, I felt closer to God than I ever had before. It was as if the walls of the convent were filled with His presence, surrounding us, guiding us. At night, as I lay in my small, simple room, I would think about the life I had left behind and feel nothing but gratitude. I didn't miss the outside world. I didn't miss the distractions, the noise. Here, everything was clear, focused. I was part of a mission far greater than myself, and I felt honored to be called to it. But as the months went by, small things began to catch my attention, things that didn't quite align with the ideals I had clung to so tightly. At first, they were easy to ignore. A harsh word from a senior sister, quickly dismissed as stress or fatigue, a rule that seemed more about control than spiritual growth. I told myself it was nothing, that no place was perfect, and that the flaws I noticed were just tests of my faith. One evening, during a meeting with the Mother Superior, I noticed how she spoke to one of the younger nuns. Her tone was sharp, almost cruel, as she criticized the girl for something trivial. The girl's face fell, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment, but she said nothing. None of us did. I wanted to believe it was an isolated moment, that it didn't mean anything. But the uneasy feeling it left in my chest lingered. Another time, I overheard a conversation between two senior sisters about a wealthy donor who had visited the convent. They spoke in hushed tones, their words dripping with a kind of eagerness that felt out of place. "If we keep him happy, the funding will continue," one of them said. "We can't afford to lose his support." The other nodded in agreement, her expression serious. I walked away quickly, pretending I hadn't heard, but the words stayed with me. Since when was our mission about pleasing donors? I tried to push these thoughts aside, to focus on the prayers, the rituals, the community, But the cracks I had noticed didn't go away. If anything, they seemed to grow wider. The warmth and peace I had felt when I first arrived were slowly being replaced by a quiet unease. It wasn't just the actions of others that troubled me. It was my own silence. Why wasn't I speaking up? Why wasn't anyone? I began to question things I had never questioned before. Was this truly the life God had called me to? Or was I holding on to an ideal that didn't exist? Was the institution I had placed so much trust in really serving His will, or was it serving itself? The questions were terrifying, but once they took root, I couldn't stop them from growing. And yet, I stayed. I stayed because I didn't know what else to do. This was my life, my purpose, the only thing I had ever wanted. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the sense that the God I had come here to serve was calling me to something different, something I wasn't ready to face. Not yet. At first, the unease was easy to dismiss. I told myself it was my own weakness, my own failure to fully adapt to the life I had chosen. But as time went on, the cracks I noticed in the convent's walls weren't just figurative. They were real, and they were growing harder to ignore. One day, I was assigned to help in the kitchen, alongside Sister Margaret, an older nun who had been in the convent for decades. She was kind, but quiet, rarely speaking unless spoken to. As we worked, she suddenly sighed, setting down the knife she'd been using to chop vegetables. "Do you ever feel like this isn't what it's supposed to be?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I froze. "What do you mean?" I asked cautiously, unsure if this was a test. She glanced around to make sure we were alone. "The rules, the way we're told to live, it's not what I imagined when I first came here. Sometimes it feels like the institution cares more about appearances than about God." Her words struck a chord, echoing thoughts I hadn't dared to voice even to myself. I wanted to press her for more, to ask what had led her to feel this way. But before I could, the kitchen door swung open and we were interrupted. Sister Margaret never brought it up again, but the seed of doubt she had planted in my mind continued to grow. As I went about my daily routines, I started to notice more. There were the whispers between senior sisters about donors and church politics, conversations that felt less like spiritual guidance and more like corporate strategy meetings. There were the rigid rules that seemed to stifle genuine compassion, rules that dictated who deserved help and who didn't. And then there were the moments of outright cruelty, often hidden behind a veneer of discipline. One of the most troubling incidents happened during confession. A young novice had been struggling, torn between her commitment to the convent and her longing for the life she had left behind. When she finally confided her doubts to one of the senior nuns, instead of being met with understanding, she was chastised. "Your weakness is a sin," the senior nun told her coldly. "You need to pray for forgiveness and rid yourself of these selfish desires." I overheard the novice crying in her room that night, muffling her sobs so no one would hear. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that it was okay to feel conflicted, that God wouldn't abandon her for being human. But I didn't. I stayed silent, afraid of what would happen if I spoke up. The weight of that silence was crushing. I started to feel like a stranger within the walls of the convent, a place that had once felt like home. The rituals that had brought me so much peace now felt hollow, performed out of obligation rather than devotion. The prayers I whispered each morning felt unanswered, as if my words were bouncing off the walls instead of reaching God. The turning point came one evening when I stumbled upon a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. I was walking past the Mother Superior's office when I heard raised voices. Curious, I paused, pressing myself against the wall to avoid being seen. Inside, the Mother Superior was speaking with a visiting priest. "We can't keep turning people away," the priest said, his tone frustrated. "The church is supposed to be a refuge for everyone, not just the ones who fit your idea of worthy." The Mother Superior's response was sharp. "We have limited resources, Father. If we open our doors to everyone, we'll lose the support of the donors who keep this convent running. Sometimes, sacrifices have to be made." I felt my stomach twist. Sacrifices. That's what they were calling it. Turning away those in need to preserve the convent's image and financial stability. I had always believed that the church was a place of unconditional love and acceptance, but here it was reduced to transactions and compromises. That night, I lay awake in my room, staring at the ceiling and feeling more lost than ever. The God I had come to serve, the God of love and mercy, seemed so far removed from the institution I had devoted my life to. How had it come to this? And why was I still here, pretending everything was fine when my heart told me it wasn't? I didn't have answers, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't ignore the cracks anymore. They were too wide, too deep, and they were threatening to break me. The days that followed were some of the darkest I'd ever experienced. The doubts I had tried so hard to suppress were now impossible to ignore. Every time I walked through the halls of the convent, every time I knelt in prayer, I felt the weight of those questions pressing down on me. How had the place I once believed to be a sanctuary turned into something so cold, so detached from the love of God? And more painfully, how could I have been so blind to it for so long? I began to feel like an outsider among the other sisters. They went about their routines with a sense of certainty that I envied but couldn't replicate. When we gathered in the chapel, their prayers seemed so effortless, their devotion so pure. Meanwhile, my own prayers felt hollow, like I was speaking into a void. The connection I had once felt with God, the sense of His presence that had guided me here, was gone. I thought maybe it was my fault. Maybe I wasn't praying hard enough, or maybe my faith wasn't strong enough. Desperate for clarity, I sought guidance from the Mother Superior. It was late one evening when I finally knocked on her door, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. She ushered me inside, her expression calm but distant, as if she already knew what I was going to say. "I've been struggling," I admitted, my voice shaking. "There are things happening here that don't feel right. I don't know if it's me, if I'm failing in my faith, or if there's something deeper going on." Her response was as swift as it was dismissive. "Doubt is a natural part of spiritual growth," she said, her tone clipped. "You need to focus on your vows and your responsibilities. The enemy uses doubt to weaken us, but you must resist." I wanted to believe her, but her words didn't bring the comfort I was searching for. They felt rehearsed, like something she had said 100 times before to other sisters who had dared to question the same things. There was no room for discussion, no space for vulnerability. The message was clear. Doubt wasn't something to explore. It was something to suppress. I left her office feeling more alone than ever. If the Mother Superior couldn't help me, who could? The sisters who had once been my family now felt like strangers. I couldn't bring myself to share my doubts with them, afraid of their judgment or worse, their pity. My isolation grew, wrapping itself around me like a heavy cloak. I turned to prayer, spending long hours in the chapel, begging God for answers. "Where are you?" I whispered into the silence. "Why can't I feel you anymore?" But no matter how fervently I prayed, no matter how many tears I shed, the silence remained. It was a silence that echoed through every corner of my soul, leaving me to wonder if God had abandoned me, or if I had somehow abandoned him. Even confession, once a source of relief and renewal, offered no solace. I remember one confession in particular, when I finally worked up the courage to voice my doubts aloud. "I'm struggling to see God in the work we're doing here," I told the priest, my voice barely audible. "It feels more like a machine than a ministry." His response was curt. "You need to focus on obedience. Your feelings are a distraction from your vows. Trust the church. It knows what is best." Obedience. That word had been drilled into me from the moment I entered the convent, and for years I had embraced it wholeheartedly. But now, it felt like a chain, binding me to something I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. How could I trust the church when everything I saw told me it had strayed so far from Christ's teachings? The breaking point came one evening during a communal prayer service. As we recited the familiar words, my voice faltered. I looked around at the other sisters, their heads bowed, their hands folded, and I felt completely disconnected. The prayers that had once brought me so much comfort now felt empty, like a ritual performed out of obligation rather than faith. I stood there frozen as a wave of grief washed over me. When the service ended, I slipped out of the chapel and walked into the courtyard, desperate for air. The stars above were bright and endless, a stark contrast to the heaviness I felt inside. I stared up at them, tears streaming down my face, and for the first time, I said the words I had been too afraid to say. "God, are you even there?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered. In that moment, I felt more lost than I ever had before. The church had been my foundation, my anchor, the thing that gave my life meaning. But now that foundation felt like it was crumbling beneath me, and I was left standing on nothing. For the first time in my life, I didn't know where to turn. I didn't know how to pray, or if there was even any point in trying. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living this way. Something had to change, but I didn't know what or how. All I knew was the overwhelming emptiness and the fear that I had been wrong about everything, about the church, about my faith, about God. And that fear was almost too much to bear. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself drawn to the chapel. It was late, the halls of the convent silent except for the soft creak of my footsteps on the worn wooden floor. The air felt heavy, like the weight of my doubts and fears had seeped into every corner of the place. As I entered the dimly lit chapel, I saw the candles flickering on the altar, their small flames casting long shadows on the walls. I knelt before the cross, my hands trembling as I clasped them together. "God, I don't know what to do anymore," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I've tried to follow you. I've given you everything, but I don't feel you here. I don't even know if you're listening." The silence was deafening, and for a moment I thought that, once again, there would be no response. But then something happened. It began as a warmth, a gentle sensation that started in my chest and spread outward, enveloping me like a soft embrace. The air seemed to shift, growing lighter, almost electric. I opened my eyes, and the chapel was no longer the same. The candlelight had grown brighter, more radiant, as if the flames were alive. The entire room was bathed in a golden glow that seemed to pulsate with a rhythm I couldn't hear but could feel. And then I saw him. Standing near the altar was a figure, cloaked in light so brilliant it should have been blinding, yet I could look directly at him. His face was kind, his eyes filled with a love so pure it brought tears to mine. There was no doubt in my mind who he was. This was Jesus, and he was looking at me with a tenderness that made the weight I had been carrying melt away. "Why are you so troubled, my child?" His voice was soft, but it resonated deeply, like it was reaching into the very core of my being. "I feel so lost," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I thought I was doing the right thing, following you, but everything feels wrong. The church, the rules, the judgment. I don't see you in it anymore." He stepped closer, and as he did, the warmth around me grew stronger. "You've been looking for me in the wrong places," he said. "I am not bound by walls or rituals. I am not found in power or in rules created by man. I am in the love you show to others, in the kindness of a listening ear, in the compassion of an open heart." His words washed over me, and suddenly the room seemed to dissolve. In its place, I saw visions, images of people and moments that had once felt ordinary, but now shone with a divine clarity. I saw myself comforting a grieving child, offering a meal to someone hungry, holding the hand of a sick elder. Each act, no matter how small, was illuminated by the same golden light that surrounded him. "This is where you will find me," he said. "Not in perfection, not in institutions, but in love. Every act of love is a reflection of me, and through love, you will always find your way back to me." The visions shifted, and I saw scenes of people hurting, those who had been cast aside, those who had been told they weren't worthy. Their faces were filled with pain, but as I watched, light began to pour into the scenes, not from the institutions they had turned to, but from individuals who reached out with compassion and kindness. "My church is not a building," Jesus continued. "It is the hearts of those who live in my love. You are not lost, my child. You have simply outgrown the place you were in. The path I have for you does not end here. It begins." His words filled me with a peace I hadn't felt in years. The doubts, the fears, the guilt, they didn't vanish entirely, but they no longer held power over me. For the first time, I understood that my faith was not about following an institution. It was about living in a way that reflected his love, even when it meant walking a path I hadn't anticipated. The vision began to fade, the golden light dimming as the chapel slowly came back into focus. But his presence didn't leave me. It stayed, a quiet reassurance in my heart that I wasn't alone. As I knelt there, tears still streaming down my face, I whispered, "Thank you." It wasn't enough to capture what I felt, but it was all I could say. I rose from the chapel floor, the room now still and silent once more. But I was different. The emptiness that had consumed me was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. I didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I had seen the truth, and I knew that wherever I went, he would be with me. And with that, I walked out of the chapel, ready to take the first step into the life he had called me to live. Leaving the convent was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. It wasn't just about walking away from a building or a routine. It felt like leaving behind a part of myself, a life I had devoted everything to. I knew I couldn't stay, not after what I had experienced, but the idea of stepping into the unknown was terrifying. Still, the memory of his words stayed with me. "You have simply outgrown the place you were in." Those words became my anchor, pulling me forward even when doubt threatened to hold me back. When I finally told the Mother Superior about my decision, her response was cold and clipped. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice devoid of the warmth I had once admired in her. "You took vows, and now you're abandoning them. Do you think the world outside these walls will understand you? You'll be lost without the church." Her words stung, but they didn't break me. I knew in my heart that my faith wasn't tied to the convent. It was something deeper, something unshakable. Still, as I packed my belongings into a single bag and said my goodbyes, the weight of her judgment lingered. The other sisters were kind but distant, their farewells polite but tinged with an unspoken sense of disapproval. I couldn't blame them. They didn't understand why I was leaving, and I didn't have the words to explain it to them. My family's reaction was even harder to face. When I arrived at my parents' doorstep, suitcase in hand, my mother's face crumpled. "Why?" she asked, tears in her eyes. "We were so proud of you. How could you just walk away from your vows? From God?" "I haven't walked away from God," I said gently, though my voice trembled. "I've found him in a way I never thought possible, but I can't serve him the way I was before. It's not where he wants me to be." My explanation didn't seem to comfort her. My father stayed silent, his disappointment written plainly on his face. I felt like a stranger in my own home, caught between their expectations and the path I knew I had to follow. It was lonely, and there were nights when I lay awake questioning everything. Was I really doing the right thing? Or had I misunderstood his call? But as difficult as those early days were, they also brought moments of unexpected grace. I began volunteering at a local shelter, helping people who had nowhere else to turn. At first, it felt strange to be out in the world, untethered from the structure of the convent. But as I worked alongside people who were struggling but resilient, broken but hopeful, I began to see God's presence in ways I never had before. It was in the laughter of a child who had been given a warm meal, in the gratitude of a mother who found a place to stay, in the quiet determination of a man rebuilding his life. These moments reminded me of the visions I had seen that night in the chapel. Acts of love, no matter how small, were reflections of him. And for the first time, I felt free, not bound by rules or rituals, but guided by a simple, profound truth. God is love, and love is the greatest act of faith. Sharing my story, however, was a different kind of challenge. I knew I needed to speak about what I had experienced, but every time I tried, I was met with resistance. Some people dismissed me outright, saying I had been misled or deceived. Others listened politely but made it clear they didn't believe me. Even among those who seemed supportive, there were moments of doubt. "Are you sure it wasn't just your imagination?" one friend asked. "Maybe it was your way of coping with stress." It hurt to have something so sacred questioned, but I learned to let go of the need for validation. My experience wasn't something I could prove, it was something I lived. And for every skeptic, there was someone who found hope in my words. I met people who were disillusioned with the church but still searching for God. People who felt lost and alone, just as I had. Their stories mirrored mine in ways I hadn't expected, and I realized that my journey wasn't just for me, it was for them too. There were still challenges. I struggled to find my place in a world that often felt at odds with the faith I had rediscovered. I faced moments of doubt, times when the weight of rejection and misunderstanding felt too heavy to bear. But in those moments, I would return to the memory of his presence, his words. You are not lost. You have simply outgrown the place you were in. As time went on, my sense of freedom and fulfillment grew. I no longer felt confined by the expectations of an institution or the judgments of others. My faith was no longer about rules or rituals. It was about relationships, with God, with others, with myself. And as I embraced this new way of living, I found a peace that I had never known before. One afternoon, as I sat with a woman at the shelter who was sharing her struggles, she looked at me and said, "You seem so calm, so certain. How do you do it?" I smiled, thinking of the long, winding road that had brought me to that moment. "I'm not always certain," I admitted, "but I've learned that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting that God is with us, even when we can't see the path ahead. And it's about choosing love, no matter how hard it gets." Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached for my hand. In that moment, I felt the presence of God so clearly, so powerfully, that it brought tears to my own eyes. This, I realized, was what he had been leading me toward all along. Not perfection, not rules, but love, pure, simple, and transformative. When I look back on my journey, I see it not as a loss of faith, but as a rediscovery of what faith truly means. I didn't leave God behind when I walked out of the convent. I found him in a way I never could have within those walls. My story isn't about rejecting the church or its teachings. It's about recognizing that true faith is not confined by human institutions, traditions, or rules. It's about love, pure, unconditional, and boundless. To anyone who feels disillusioned, to those questioning their place in the church or their relationship with God, I want to tell you, it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to doubt. Faith isn't about blind obedience. It's about seeking the truth, even when it leads you down an unexpected path. Doubt doesn't mean you've lost your faith. Sometimes it's the first step toward finding it. What I've learned is that God doesn't dwell in perfection or power. He isn't found in grand cathedrals or rigid doctrines. He's found in the quiet acts of kindness, in the moments of compassion that ripple through the lives of others. Faith is not about what you can prove. It's about what you choose to live. And every day, you have the choice to live with love, humility, and grace. For the skeptics who may be listening, I understand your doubts. I've felt them too. But I ask you to look beyond the failings of institutions, beyond the flaws of people who claim to speak for God. Seek him not in the noise of authority, but in the silence of your heart. You don't have to be perfect to feel his love. You just have to be open to it. To believers, I offer this challenge. Let your faith be more than words. Don't settle for rituals or routines that leave no room for love or mercy. Faith should transform you, make you kinder, more compassionate, more willing to see the divine in every person you meet. Don't be afraid to step outside the boundaries of what's familiar. Sometimes, the most profound encounters with God happen in the places you least expect. We live in a world that often feels fractured, divided by fear, pride, and misunderstanding. But the truth is, we are all connected. Every act of kindness, every choice to love instead of hate, every moment of grace has the power to mend those fractures and draw us closer to each other and to God. Love is the thread that binds us together, and it is through love that we see the face of the Creator. If my story has taught me anything, it's that faith isn't about certainty. It's about trust. It's about stepping forward even when you don't have all the answers, believing that God is with you in every step. And He is. Whether you're in the depths of doubt or standing on the mountaintop, He is there, guiding you, loving you, calling you toward Him. So let us choose love. Let us choose hope. Let us choose to be the light in a world that so desperately needs it. And in doing so, let us remember this simple but profound truth that changed my life. God's love is not bound by walls or rules. It is infinite, and it is for all of us. You are not alone. You are loved, and that love has the power to change everything.